for this introduction, and thank you, Wensveen, for this opportunity to tell a bit of my story. It's the second time I'm presenting this story, and I had to cut it down from 45 to half hour, and now it's 20 minutes, so I might be speeding up at a certain point. I hope you bear with me. This is my special tribute to Wensveen's shirt, and it also features as a background on the statics of intelligence. Next slide. Oh, I don't see it here. Yes. So the structure of this lecture, it's a bit of my personal account of my relationship to aesthetics. I'm talking about the past 3 waves of design aesthetics. I will talk about the S word, and I will talk about the 4th wave, or at least towards an aesthetics of intelligence. When I talk about aesthetics in relationship to design, I see it as a critical reflection of how people create and design, but also how they use, enjoy, or dislike design. And in my belief, aesthetics is fundamental to understand how design technology affect people's emotion, their understanding of the world, and also their attitude towards life. So this is my image of my Facebook when Facebook didn't exist as part of industrial design, because I studied industrial design engineering in Delft almost 31 years ago. And at that point, my teachers were telling me that good design is aesthetic. This is Brown, I think, very well known for having good aesthetic quality, where it's integral to its usefulness, so combining beauty and functionality, and well-executed objects can be beautiful. So this is Dieter Rams, and he has 10 principles, and this is principle 5, good design is unobtrusive, in order to leave room for the user's self-expression. Perhaps his most famous one, less is more, where good design is as little design as possible. See, this was in my first year, my second year, what my teachers were telling me. And then went on the study trip with the study association to Groningen and just tagged along. And there I went to the Groningen Museum to Memphis, an exhibition where we saw these type of examples, or lights like these. And I was, well, having an aesthetic experience. I must say I was completely overwhelmed by the wildness of the colors, the wild combination of shapes, the total disrespect for good design. And I thought like, wow, are they allowed to do this? Am I allowed to do this? And this somehow resonated with me because I was a skateboarder, trying to be a surfer, so more counterculture, maybe disrespectful to authority. Being a lover of physical magazines, where they had a total disrespect for proper graphic design. The work of David Carson, for example. So this appealed to my personal values for aesthetics. So inspiration from countercultures, challenging the status quo, bodily and emotional expression, and values of freedom, dynamics, contrast, yet also inviting. So this was my, I think, second design assignment. We had to design a video text terminal, and taking my inspiration from Memphis, close down when it's not in use, and when it's used, it was opening up. So in a way, that started long before in the first waves of industrial design and aesthetics, it was an aesthetics of appearance, where the emerging technologies were new materials like metal and glass, but later on also plastics, and formal qualities of shape, color, proportion, and texture, and disciplines of product design and industrial design. And social cultural qualities were simplicity or in functionality, efficiency, economics, so form follows function, or form follows emotion. So this is in a way the first way. Oh. Oh, yep, that was the... I should be less enthusiastic when I'm touching my keyboard. So form follows function, or form follows emotion. So this was my bachelor and master education, my ingenieurs diploma. And then I moved to, started my PhD, first in Delft, and then was invited by Lou Vijs to join the Department of Industrial Design here in Eindhoven. So 20 years ago. At that point, we were somewhat fed up with the way that they treated interaction design, putting screens on physical products. And we wrote a pamphlet where we don't think products, think experiences. Don't think beauty in appearance, but beauty in interaction. And don't think ease of use, but think enjoyment of the experience. Coming up with different examples where we critique on the status quo and in a way attacking the cognitive approach and vouching for a more embodied approach. So this was my own work. I was a long time known as the alarm clock guy, trying to, instead of putting sensors on people's body, trying to see how we can express ourselves in the way we interact with things. So is it possible when we offer freedom of interaction that there's also freedom of expression? So this related to my values of freedom of interaction, bodily expression, emotional expression, and dynamic action. And what we demonstrated in an example that there was a relationship between how people felt and how they interacted with their device. Of course, a presentation for Lou Vijs needs to have a formula, so this is my formula, where we try to have regression equations to model the emotional mood out of action and pattern parameters. At that point, we were not the only ones who were talking about the change of aesthetics. Tony Dunn was talking about an aesthetics of use. In Sweden, they were talking about aesthetics of computational artifacts, and saying also aesthetics as the proper foundation for technology design. It's good to see Philip sitting there. We continue this work on aesthetics of interaction and moving more towards values and tying values, ethics, and aesthetics together because both deal with values. More specifically influenced by pragmatist aesthetics, trying to find this relation between ethics and aesthetics. So this is the second wave, aesthetics of interaction. Digital media, computation, interactivity, and a different set of formal qualities, temporality, physicality, input-output. And there also are the social cultural qualities, more modern values, functionality, cognition, usability, or more postmodern, emotional, ethical self-expression. So 10 years ago, maybe a smaller third wave of aesthetics came up, aesthetics of transformation, where disciplines of critical design, service design, social design, and design activism. Talking about disruptive aesthetics, to open up the relation between people's behavior and emotion and related to art activism, for example. So examples of beautiful strangeness in order to demonstrate with design, with a not common aesthetic of beautiful products, but a strangeness that shows us social issues through design and aesthetics. And Thomas Markussen is talking about aesthetic acts, which reorient perception and action. Ilpokoskinen had the same notion. When the attention of design shifts to social forces, aesthetic concepts tied to products lose a good deal of their relevance. And he talks about different strategies for more social design. About provoking change and creating communities of discussion and discourse. More convivial aesthetics, bringing communities together. A more conceptual aesthetic, where aesthetics is more a found object, trying to capture the local vernacular. So what else happened since then? In a way, not that much. I mean, we have many beautiful products, and in a way, the entire world is being designed. But the development in research in aesthetics came to a halt in a way, which was now called the S word. So we didn't talk about aesthetics, because aesthetics in a way was unpopular. And in design, it became a neglected area of research, where creativity and innovation are far more popular, because they bring more money into it. And while design thinking gained influence in innovation management, it repressed the role of aesthetic judgments. And I think within design thinking, you never hear the S word, or never people talk about aesthetics and the differences of what people want out of design. Aesthetics is also unpopular, I think, with the designers themselves. I think already when I started studying, it was the dreaded S word of styling. In a way, it seemed that aesthetics is about a superficial layer to package some underlying technology. I think also we should be honest and say that the role of aesthetics is problematic, and it has been used extensively to persuade consumers to buy commodities. And the famous designer Dieter Rams, I think also recently said that he somehow regretted his influence on this consumeristic behavior. In a way, aesthetics is also highly subjective and exclusive. Who decides what is beautiful? It's also hard to measure and therefore hard to research. And some say, well, it was claimed by the domain of philosophy and cultural theory and therefore was taken away from designers. I think we should also be honest that other design aspects are more important. Sustainability and inclusivity are far more urgent topics. And I think designers need to have so many competences on top of all the things we already need to do that somehow the development of aesthetics fell behind. But I don't think it's irrelevant. I mean, this is the State of the Union, European Union, Ursula von der Leyen, who also says we need to give our systemic change its own distinct aesthetic to match style with sustainability. Aesthetics is also not irrelevant in relation to ethics, as they both deal with values. And it's also not irrelevant in relation to the emerging technologies. So my aim is to redevelop the competence of aesthetics, which brings us to the now, and I would like to position and paddle for this fourth wave, aesthetics of intelligence. Taking a broad definition of artificial intelligence, and what I think we'll see, or we're already seeing, is smart products with a product aesthetics. Or with a UX aesthetics, and maybe some social aesthetics of how to create these services. But I think there's an underlying fundamental layer of aesthetics that we should develop. So some examples, how we move from appearance to interaction to intelligence. It's the prize-winning project of Anke Oosterhout. So when we look at the aesthetics, we can see it as a product with a detailed execution and craftsmanship. We can also look at the interaction, the beauty of the shape change and the haptic force feedback. But I think what's more interesting is the intelligence behind it and how that it has a certain beauty. How there's a balance between human agency and system control. And there are new ways of engaging with the world of energy control. And beyond screen-based interaction. Here's another example, Felix Ross. So again, we can look at the interaction, the beautiful interplay between human and the machine, or the haptic dialogue to exchange intentions. But on the intelligence, it becomes a discussion piece for how we want to engage with smart entities, but also like the autonomous vehicle, but also the cultural aspects of driving intelligent cars. Talking about the cultural aspects of aesthetics, this project of Bart Bolluyt, looking at theories of Hofstede and different parameters and differences of cultural communities, and designing an intelligent agent with these specific parameters of uncertainty avoidance, so having the same device, yet different interactions, in a way different intelligence, trying to capture it in the video. In order to see whether people perceive these differences and whether they perceive them as culturally different. So on the different aspects,
come on,
masculine cultures or feminine cultures,
only 250 meters to go. Give it all you've got. That's it, great. Now take a 5-minute break.
And one on power distance.
Come on, keep pushing.
Hey. Good afternoon, sir.
Only 250 meters to go.
Of course. What would you like?
Give it all you've got.
Okay. A mock-up.
Then doing a little test and demonstrating that people actually perceive these cultural differences within the interaction with such an intelligent agent. I think there's also a role for aesthetics on being reflective, provide a critical perspective. The work of Luc Noothout, and as a critique to how intelligence is currently being used by big companies that want our data and thinking, can it not be a bit more democratic? Coming up with 3 or actually 4 different designs and showing them during Dutch Design Week and engaging the larger general audience of what AI could be for them and what the strengths but also what the weaknesses and difficulties of AI are. Because in a way, we can look at a history of beauty, but then I think we all know the examples when we talk about intelligence, which has a certain ugliness, a loss of privacy, exclusion, or commercial exploitation. So in this 4th wave of aesthetics of intelligence, we see the emerging technology of machine learning, generative networks, and the formal qualities, agency, emergence, intentionality, uncertainty, and how can we design for those, and with which values? So is there an aesthetics of uncertainty, which was the work of Alex de Kruijf, recent master student, who looked more at ludic intelligence.
Data is generated all around us, hidden in the background, captured by the digital world. We try to analyze it, control it, in order to make it fit with our intentions and lifestyles. But what if there were others with their own intentions and unique views on data? The light catcher tries to look for the brightest point in the environment, actively trying to catch as much light as possible. The temperature feeler is a bit more passive, simply following along with the temperature. The data collectors provide contextual data for the interpreter. The interpreter is an intelligent lamp that picks a moment and a color using a machine learning algorithm. The interpreter is semi-supervised. It learns from the preferences of the user but it also learns from its own predictions. Because the predictions will not always be accurate, it leaves an element of uncertainty. Inspired by animistic and ludic design, this project explores an approach to use uncertainty as a material for the design of aesthetics of intelligence in the home, placing an emphasis on exploration and experimentation.
So looking more at everyday aesthetics and exploring an aesthetics of uncertainty, and challenging the centrality of user optimization and looking at animism instead of anthropomorphism. What intelligence, artificial intelligence, but also human intelligence and natural intelligence brings in is that whose aesthetic values are we talking about? Are these designers' intended values or the user's intended values? Or actually what happens when it's being deployed? Or are these institutional values, corporate, legal, or the values of the artificial agent? So I think this brings a new challenge and complexity to designing aesthetics when all these values somehow need to coexist next to each other. And I think an aesthetic approach to that of balancing, finding harmony in how these different values relate to each other, I think is necessary. These non-human agents can also come from plants and animals and soil, water. And this was the project more on post-human design of the students you see here that were part of a course exploring a post-human design approach to aesthetics of intelligence.
As we enter the Anthropocene, the proposed geological epoch in which we find ourselves now, we see that there is no place on Earth that remains untouched by humans. Our human-centric beliefs, from the fantasy that we can control the planet, to the notion that we are above other things, such as animals, plants, and machines, compels a vision of the world that includes the so-called end of nature. The natural, the notion of nature created by humans, and the artificial, have merged at every scale, creating so-called nature cultures. One perfect example of such a nature culture is the environment of Eindhoven. We will have a brief look at a very ordinary ecology in Eindhoven. This ecology, among other things, consists of actors such as the pigeon, a generative adversarial model, and humankind. These actors are closely interrelated and co-shape each other's behavior. So, let's briefly speculate and try to understand if and how these interrelations are shaped. This GAN entity randomly generates bird-like sounds. It is co-shaped by a human entity and it specifically aims to explore the relations between itself and pigeons. This pigeon entity is still quite far away from the GAN. The human entity is trying to establish a relation between the pigeon, himself, and the GAN, by putting small breadcrumbs on the soft moss. Perhaps he thinks this will lure the pigeon out of its nest. The GAN seems to be okay with this behavior. Although we might not be sure, the pigeon seems not to care. Rather than coming over to check out the GAN, or the breadcrumbs, it seems that it prefers to stay on its place. Oh dear. The human entity is triggered again. It has spotted a pigeon entity sitting on the GAN from outside of its window, and checks if the GAN is still working. It ultimately decides to hide the GAN from the possible rain, hoping for a better tryout tomorrow. As you perhaps have seen, a post-human context relies on the assumption that everything is interrelated. Every non-human has been shaped by humans, every human has been shaped by non-humans, and non-humans shape each other. In this process, all actors have equal agency. Whether relationships between actors is intentionally or unintentionally, it might be that we, humans, will never understand the relationships that involve non-human actors. It also might be that no explicit relationship between non-human actors will ever establish, or only establish over a longer period of time. The latter might be applied to context of the pigeon and a GAN. Yet, we cannot be sure about that. In a post-human context, The challenge lies in our human limitations of conceptualizing the relationship that non-human actors, such as a pigeon and a GAN, might have. Ultimately, it is human-centric thinking that drives our desire to fully understand the world as what it is.
So the first time I saw this video in the final presentation for the course, it gave me an aesthetic experience. Not as an immediate pleasure of beauty. I mean, it seemed unsuccessful in attracting birds. I would have never used the plastic jumbo bag to care for the device. But the video was about caring. Caring for different relationships between humans, birds, and the generative adversarial model. So for me, it wasn't about beauty. Maybe the personal experience was more about sublimity, a feeling of being overwhelmed by something immensely large that I could not understand. In a way, it was also violating with my values, but I also see that there's something huge behind this work that we at the moment cannot understand, but I think we should try to understand a bit more. This brings us to the now and to you, I think, looking also to our students. So for me, main lessons from this talk: explore your personal aesthetic values, your inspiration and your influences. Right, and respect the 4 waves of aesthetics in design of appearance, interaction, social, and intelligence. I think we need to reappreciate, but also reorient aesthetics for the future development of design as well. And suggesting to develop a design competence in aesthetics of intelligence. Talking about inspirations and influences, today is also 10 years ago that my influence, my inspiration, Professor Kees Overbeke, passed away. I want to shortly remember this, and then I want to thank you for your attention.